Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the President's Folly Podcast. I'm joined again with Keith Preston to discuss part two of our history of U.S. foreign policy. Now, we sort of left off with the Texan Revolution, which is important in the sense that it led to the Mexican War with the United States. Now, Mexico became independent in 1821, and it had a sort of federal republic. And Santa Anna in 1824 basically became a dictator and overthrew the Republican government. And there were large groups of dissenting rebels throughout Mexico. There were separatists in the Yucatan and other parts of Mexico. And his ruthlessness, which we would see in the Goliad campaign and the Texan Revolution, was seen even earlier. He would just summarily execute thousands of individuals if they had revolted against him. And one example was in the province of Zacatecas in Mexico, northern Mexico, who rebelled against his rule because they perceived that he was overturning the Constitution. And within Texas, which is the interest of the Texan Revolution, there were basically the two important ethnic groups were the Tejanos, which were Creoles, native-born Spaniards who lived in Texas, and then the immigrants from the American South and the American West. Now, the immigration to Texas was the result of, in the 1820s and 30s, there was large-scale Comanche and Apache raids on the frontier settlements of Mexico. And they were stealing cattle and people and burning crops and generally being very hostile and dangerous natives. And so they wanted to encourage immigration from the United States in order to secure their northern frontier. But they began to realize that as the white population outnumbered the Tejano population, that they're like, uh-oh, we might get in trouble here. We don't want to have all these Americans coming into Texas. And so they tried to make it more difficult for the immigrants to come in, but it was too late. Too many had already come in. The border was too porous. It was basically wide open spaces with small population density. So it was very hard to enforce the border controls. And both the Tejanos and the Americans, the gringos, I guess we can call them, disliked the autocratic rule of Santa Anna. And so he marches troops up to Texas to reclaim it. And of course, what happens is the United States at this time is looking very interested here because we want Texas, we want the Southwest. So we're sort of rooting for the Texans. We have troops in Louisiana ready to move if things should be Mexico makes any threatening moves in our direction. And ultimately, early on, he's successful, Santa Anna. He butchers hundreds of Texans at Goliad. But ultimately, after the Alamo, they're galvanized and defeat him at San Jacinto. And he's forced to then give up his claims on Texas. Now, then Texas seeks to be integrated in the United States, but it takes a while to happen. So for 10 years, it's an independent country. And most of the problem revolved around the fact that the Whigs, the anti-slavery party in the United States, did not want Texas to be annexed as a state because they perceived correctly that we'd be used by the southern plantation owners to increase the power of the slave states. Because we saw the 3/5 clause where a slave was 3/5 of a person when it came to representation, I think, in Congress. So having more slave states in Texas and others in the Southwest would only expand U.S. power, the slaveholders' power. So they were opposed to that, but eventually Polk and others were able to leverage Congress to allow them to annex Texas. Now, they knew this would be essentially war with Mexico. They knew that Mexico would not tolerate this. And so Polk sends troops to the contested area in Texas to forestall any Mexican attacks. And the Mexicans do send troops, and there's a brief skirmish. And Polk famously says, Americans have died on American soil. Well, that's not true. It was disputed soil. And we knew that it would be a provocation in annexing Texas. Now, we had also tried to buy the Southwest from Mexico, but they were unstable. They had, in the period of Texan independence, they went through 6 different presidents when Texas was an independent country. And they went through 16 different managers of finance. So Mexico was a mess. They couldn't at all have a stable government long enough to sign a treaty with anyhow. And the big element in pushing for the Southwest annexation was the Southern plantation holders. They wanted to expand in that direction in order to increase the power of the slave states by incorporating them as slave states. And also you had the generic westward expansion of the American West. So those two regional elements, whereas the Northeast, the Whig elements were not as favorable to this. And so Polk kind of engineers this war to expand America to fulfill its manifest destiny, to get California, to get Texas, to get Arizona and New Mexico. And that's sort of the breakdown of the lead up to the war with Mexico. And it's funny because today we have people talking about how Mexicans are coming over the border, taking over Texas. But it was exactly the other way around in the 1830s. So is there anything you want to add to the build up to the war with Mexico?
Well, I think there's several things that need to be taken into account when we look at the backstory to all of this. I tend to regard the Mexican War as a continuation of the geopolitical rivalry that had existed between the United States and Spain. If we go back to the period before before Mexico achieved its independence from Spain in 1821, and if we go back and look at the Monroe Doctrine, what we see is that the Americans largely had their designs on the entire Western Hemisphere in the sense that they had this idea of cultivating an American empire that would span not only the North American continent from coast to coast, but also I think it's quite clear that the Americans sought hegemony in Latin America as well. And we see that in the writings of early American leaders going all the way back to the late 18th century. So when the United States was first formed, the much of Latin America was Spanish colonies and Portuguese colonies, and then gradually these regions began to achieve their independence. And I think the United States started to set their designs on these regions for the purpose of incorporating them into this kind of American empire, either literally or figuratively, in the sense of either annexing territories or incorporating them into this wider sphere of influence. And I think that was what the Monroe Doctrine was really about. It was not just about preventing European powers from interfering in the Western Hemisphere. It was about creating American hegemony in the Western Hemisphere, and certainly American foreign policy ever since then has followed that trajectory. So I think the thesis holds up over time. But when Mexico achieved their independence in 1821, I think the Americans started to look at it like, okay, now it's our turn. We can gradually incorporate this region into our own sphere of influence. And that in turn led to the kind of expansionist effort that we saw that led up to the Mexican War, where there was an effort to annex some of these regions and bring Texas into the into the United States itself. In some ways, I think this is also a representation of the conflicts in American society that led up to the Civil War, because the breakdown in terms of the Mexican War was that the war was, as you said, highly opposed by the Whig Party, by anti-slavery elements. In fact, Henry David Thoreau actually went to jail as part of a tax protest, in part because of the Mexican War during the 1850s. So it's something of a conflict that was brewing in the United States at the same time between the more traditional old world sectors of American society concentrated in the South and this more Enlightenment influenced northern part of the United States as well. I agree that the primary interest of the westward expansion that led up to the Mexican War was the expansion of the slave system in the South, of this plantation system. And I think that's one of the main reasons why there was opposition to it in the North, but it also reflected this growing split that was taking place between this more traditional Southern society with its kind of static class system, and more of a traditional European model society, and this Northern industrial society that was influenced by liberalism. And the Mexican War is really kind of a prelude, I think, to the Civil War that happened just a short time later. in the sense that you start to see these cleavages develop in the United States over the Mexican War and over the issues that were tangential upon the Mexican War. And then those come to a head a decade later during the U.S. Civil War.
Yes, yes. One thing that needs to be pointed out as well is that these breakaway republics from Spain were as you said about the U.S. colonies, they themselves were Jacobin republics as well. Less effective than the United States, to be sure, but similarly modeled. Mexico is also an expansionist Jacobin state, just much less successful than the United States turned out to be. One of the interesting aspects of the Mexican War is that, like the War of 1812, and even, well, not so much the American Revolution, but the War of 1812 and this war, the United States was basically fighting like a civilized nation. General Winfield Scott was a general of the European school, line of battle, maneuvers, not so much, grinding down civilian populations in total war scenarios, or bushwhacking, which was popular in the Revolution, then also in the Civil War. He was more of the old school European general. You march up, you maneuver, you outflank, and the civilian population was more or less left alone, at least by his men. Taylor was a little more wild and woolly, and his troops were a little less controlled. But generally speaking, though, the United States policy was not the policy that we'd later see with Grant in the Civil War, of specifically targeting foodstuffs, cities, and harming civilian population centers. Now, part of this is, I think, explained by Weagley rather well, and is the American way of war. From the American Revolution to the Civil War, America was a developing and relatively weak nation. And so we had to rely on indirection, indirect means of warfare, guerrilla warfare, and basic general rules of decency, because we had a very real chance of being conquered. England could have conquered us in 1812 or in the Revolution. And so we had a very strong incentive to not act in such a way that there'd be reprisals later on. But once you get to the Civil War, the United States is at the point where we're so strong that nobody can really challenge us. And so we can kind of do what we want, and there's no way for anybody to meaningfully enforce any sort of code of conduct on us, because we're too big to scold, so to speak. But Mexico really is the last war where Americans are more or less civilized in their treatment of the civilian population.
Yeah, I think this is a crucial period because we do see in the Civil War this transition of American warfare towards this total war model. In fact, a lot of modern people don't really understand that it was largely the United States that invented the concept of total war during the Civil War, where it's the entire population is mobilized for the purpose of waging war, and the entire population of the opposition is considered to be a legitimate target. This is the kind of thing, obviously, that we saw in the 20th century during the World Wars, where whole societies were considered to be at war with each other, and civilians just as much as actual combat troops. In fact, that's how things like the bombing of Dresden and Hamburg and the nuking of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that's how that could be justified, or at least rationalized, in that the perception was that the entire society was at war with one another. And this kind of thinking starts to develop during the U.S. Civil War. So this is really a time period in which war is undergoing a transformation from this old European model, where war by modern standards was almost like a sporting event, to this idea of essentially a no-holds-barred approach to war, where anything goes as long as you win, and that includes attacking civilian targets and things of that nature as well. The Mexican War, in some ways, was also sort of a practice for the Civil War. I mean, a lot of the generals that fought on both sides in the U.S. Civil War had actually been veterans of the Mexican War. Some of them had been more rank and file soldiers, and others had been had already been experienced officers by that point. So the Mexican War was really sort of an incubator for what happened in the Civil War. And a lot of American military leaders really cut their teeth during the Mexican War. The Mexican War also became something of a prototype for a lot of future American wars. It was really the first war of expansion where the United States was formally annexing territories. Prior to this, American warfare had largely been limited to the attacks on the indigenous people in North America, where the borders and things of that nature were often not as clearly defined. And then it was in the Mexican War that the United States actually started to identify actual territory to annex and bring under American hegemony. And this really set the prototype for all of the future wars of expansion that happened throughout the rest of the 19th century and on into the early 20th century, including Hawaii and the Philippines and Puerto Rico and all that. So this is really how the American empire starts to be built, going all the way back to the mid 19th century.
Yes, yes. One thing that's very important that sort of divides the Mexican War era from the Civil War era is rapid advances in military technology. So between 1815 and say 1850, military technology didn't develop that much. The tactics at Waterloo were more or less effective in 1846 when the Mexican War took place. And so, that was just the standard understanding of military tactics at the time, where you'd have smoothbore muskets, which maybe had an effective range of 100, maybe 100 yards, probably less than that. And you'd have to have large bodies of men massed together to fire in volleys. Napoleon had pioneered the idea of the grand battery, the concentration of heavy artillery to blast a hole through enemy lines and then exploit that with cavalry or an infantry charge. And then cavalry could also deliver the crucial shock element. Well, once the enemy troops were weakened and wavering, you could send in the cavalry to break them. And these tactics were all effectively used in Mexico. And the generals that would later fight the Civil War used all of these methods. But really, two things changed in military technology that made this infeasible and led to the massive bloodbath of the Civil War. One was the mini ball, which was a new cartridge for the new bullet for the rifled muskets. Previously, rifled muskets were not used very widely. There was the Kentucky rifle, which is a hunting rifle used during the American Revolution, the War of 1812. But those weapons, the problem was with the cylindrical ball, gas could escape around the ball, so you'd lose propellant power because of the way because it was a spherical ball. But whereas the mini ball, invented by Claude Etienne Moniz, was a cylindrical canonical ball rather, and the back was such that it would expand as it went down the barrel, so the gas wouldn't escape, which allowed for the first time effective use of mass production of rifles in rifle bullets, which extended the gun's range from maybe 100 yards to 300 to 400 yards with properly trained men, which made the old cavalry charges and infantry bayonet charges near suicidal. And in artillery, a similar revolution happened with the rifled cannons. Now, they were very effective in counter battery fire at knocking out other people's cannons. Cannons at the time either fired solid shot, which would like ricochet and roll around and not lop off limbs, or canister. High explosive wasn't invented yet. And so the rifled cannons, one of their problems was they weren't quite as effective at firing canister has to be fired up close, so the distance is negated with canister shot, and they weren't. The sort of bowling ball effect of the solid shot was less effective from the rifled cannon, so it was pretty much reserved for counter battery fire. Smoothbores, the 12-pound Napoleons, as they were called after Napoleon III, where they would roll them up and then blast away at the enemy troops. But the problem was during the war, riflemen could snipe out the artillerymen before they could even shoot back. And so they created these, they made it very difficult to deploy artillery effectively to attack infantry. They were more effective defensively because as the enemy closed with bayonets, you could then blast them at point blank range. But if you were on the offense, enemy artillery, or rifles rather, could just pick off your artillerymen. And cavalry were done for as well. Rifle shots could shoot cavalry at great distances. So the great cavalry charges of Napoleon were completely obsolete. They were more or less relegated to mobile infantry as in dragoons, or scouting and observational purposes. But the fact that warfare had fundamentally, the weaponry had fundamentally changed and made Napoleonic tactics obsolete, which one could see in the battle in the Crimean War in the early 1850s, that this had already begun to happen. But the Americans weren't paying attention, and neither were the Europeans for that matter. And when it finally came to the fore, it was a bloodbath, where you have hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands of people getting slaughtered on the battlefield with these weapons and technology. And really, the Confederate and Yankee forces never really came to terms with this new technological development. Someone like Stonewall Jackson and Sherman might have come closest in their view of advanced maneuver warfare. You advance quickly, you outmaneuver your opponents, whereas Grant was kind of a bludgeon. He just beat you into the ground, and if he lost 20,000 guys in a day, he didn't care. And Lee also committed serious mistakes. For instance, at the 7 Days Battle in Virginia, he lost unnecessary amounts of men fighting entrenched positions of McClellan, and of course the great disaster of Pickett's charge at Gettysburg. So the military training in Mexico, in some ways, set some bad precedents that both Union and Confederate generals failed to grow out of, which led to this generic bloodbath. Only a few generals on either side really overcame that. And the other thing is, to go back to Mexico, is this idea of engineering a crisis. When Polk engineers this crisis where there's this conflict in disputed territories, Lincoln would engineer this with Fort Sumter. Roosevelt would engineer this with Pearl Harbor. This is a very this tactic is well worn in the American tradition of setting up a situation where the other side attacks first, but is clearly responding to previous American provocations, to make them look like they were the aggressor, giving America the moral high ground. So if you want to add to that so far, Keith?
Well, the technological advancements that you mentioned were extremely important. I'm glad you brought that up, because those really did change the dynamics of warfare during this time. Even as something as simple as the mini ball. Like, the mini ball is a really primitive technology by modern standards, obviously, but that did really have the effect of making war that much more lethal. I mean, if it was really any, aside from changes in tactical approaches, if there was anything that made the Civil War as lethal as it was really the mini ball, and as well as the advancements in cannon technology as well. It was these kinds of weapons that allowed for a much larger number of casualties to be generated. And I think this is something that also started to change the dynamics of warfare, not only in the sense of the kind of weapons that were being used, but alterations in tactics, because of the fact that the older line and column model of warfare became largely obsolete because of these technological changes. I think this was a major contributing factor to the development of this model of total warfare, where it's just got to be about killing as many people as possible. The technological changes, I don't think, can certainly be discounted as far as something that really did have this kind of transformative effect on war. In fact, we see the same thing later on in the 20th century in World War I, for example, when machine guns and poison gas and airplanes and all of that kind of stuff were introduced into warfare for the first time. We see that as well dramatically changed the way that war was being fought, and the things that you could do to the enemy and the things that the enemy would do in response. So the kind of technological innovations that we started to see in the mid-19th century really did have the effect of creating the technological pretext for modern war. A lot of critics of modern war tend to focus on issues like ideological changes or things of that nature, and changes in the way people think about war and all of these kinds of things. But I think that the role of technology has to be considered as well. because technology is really what made modern war possible. It would have been impossible to do some of the kinds of things that have been done in modern warfare in past times simply because of this, because of the technological limitations. And that combined with various changes in the modes of thinking that people had about warfare created this kind of framework in which modern warfare, with its extremely destructive nature, takes place.
Yeah, yeah. The when it comes to the U.S. Civil War, as far as the pretexts and justifications, now the classic narrative is that it was primarily about slavery, and the neo-Confederate narrative is that it was about states' rights and tariffs. I think probably elements of all three were intermixed with the causes of the war. One of the things that I've pointed out, and I think neo-Confederates have pointed out, given that the United States was born in a rebellion against England, and that we practice an active revolution and secession from England, that it's really hypocritical to then say, well, okay, yeah, the Declaration of Independence, that we all have the right to overthrow unjust tyrannical authorities, doesn't actually hold for you Confederates. Sorry, guys, it only it's like a one-time thing. We can do it in 1776, but we can't do it in 1861. It really seems that the justification is the same as it was in 1776, and the defenders of the Union cause will split hairs, and they'll say, well, no, 1776 was the right of revolution, not the right of secession. But you see, here's the thing. The right of revolution presupposes secession, because secession is itself an act of revolution. And it's really kind of a threadbare pretext. You really can't have a country founded on revolutionary secession and then say, well, sorry, guys, it's too late for you. So what are your thoughts on that, Keith?
Well, what's interesting about that is that in some ways, I think it's true that the argument that says, well, the American Revolution was just that. It was a war of revolution, whereas the Southern secession was a war of secession. I think a case can be made for that, but in the sense that the American Revolution was something that was actually far more radical and extreme in nature. Than the Southern secession was. If we look at the American Revolution, what we see is that there was an effort there that was being made to essentially transform an entire society. If we look at the founding documents of the American Revolution, for example, the Declaration of Independence, we see that this is the philosophy of the Enlightenment. This is the philosophs being applied to domestic American politics. I mean, the Revolution of 1776 was America's version of the revolution of the French Revolution of 1789. It may not have veered off in quite as extreme a direction, but it was still rooted in the same kind of philosophical concepts and many of the same kinds of motivations. And what we see coming out of the American Revolution is the creation of a new model society where the monarchy is being abolished, the hereditary titled aristocracy is being abolished, where the church and state are being separated, and all of these other things that were definitive of traditional European societies are being eliminated in favor of this kind of Enlightenment influenced republic. Now, when the South seceded in 1861, there wasn't nearly as great an effort to transform the society internally. In fact, it was just the opposite. You could argue that it was a type of conservative, I wouldn't even say a revolution. It was more of a conservative secession in the sense that the South said, well, we just want to conserve what we're doing here in our region, and we don't want to be any longer connected to the United States, which is actually moving in a more radical direction over time. So we have this conservative secession on one hand versus this ideologically based revolution on the other hand that happened in 1776. For example, if you read the Confederate Constitution and you read the American Constitution, they're largely the same. It's not that there's no evidence that the Confederacy was trying to create a whole new society. They were just trying to preserve their own little corner, and they thought that was being increasingly coming under the threat of the federal government. And it is somewhat strange that the United States would be founded on the basis of a revolution, not only a secession by the 13 colonies, but an actual revolution where the colonial governments were actually overthrown, and then object to a mere secession by the what amounted to the established governments that were already in existence in the southern states. There wasn't really even much in the way of an internal revolution in a political sense in the South, much less in an ideological sense. So the Confederacy was very mild in terms of its own ideological leanings and its own actions. It simply was about walking away from the United States and largely keeping everything else the same as it had been previously. And as far as the causes of this, the standard narrative, as you said, is basically the war against slavery versus the war for states' rights and against the Northern Tariff. I think both of those points of view are right. I think the Confederate narrative and the Union narrative are largely correct. It's not a question of either or. But I think that there was something much more fundamental going on here. When I was in graduate school, I actually wrote a paper about this, outlining this theory. And it was interesting because my professor was a specialist on the Civil War. But he also had gone to Berkeley in the 1960s, so you can imagine what his perspective was on the war itself and on related ideological questions. But I actually outlined a theory where the war between the states was essentially a class war. It was a class war between between Europe, a European model feudal or quasi-feudal agrarian society versus an Enlightenment-based industrial republic. It was during this time that the North was increasingly becoming industrialized. The North certainly was a society based on the mercantile values that came out of classical liberalism and the Enlightenment and things like that, whereas the South, while I think it would be a mistake to say they practiced feudalism in the South. Murray Rothbard used to argue that, but I think that was a bit of a reach. The North had this kind of, the South had this kind of primitive agrarian society. It was sort of a gentry-based society. It wasn't really a feudal aristocracy that was in power in the South. It was more of a gentry, but it was the same kind of static agrarian society with slaves and with tenured farmers and indentured servants and sharecroppers and all of that. Very similar to what you would have found in a traditional European society with some modifications. So I actually see this as something of a class war, sort of a continuation of the class war that existed in Europe during this time between the growing industrial bourgeois class and the historic agrarian feudal class. Keep in mind that prior to the American Civil War of 1861, there had been the revolutions in 1848 in Europe, and which was largely efforts by the capitalist class, the industrial class, the mercantile class, what the Marxists called the bourgeois class, which had been influenced by the ideological values of the Enlightenment and classical liberalism. These forces were coming to power in Europe. They were trying to overturn the traditional monarchies and aristocracies and the established churches and all of these other institutions that were associated with the ancient regime. And the South, the culture of the South and the political order, economic order of the South was the closest thing the United States ever had to a traditional European model society. And while it may have departed from the European model in some particular ways, it was a lot closer to that than what the North was. It was this kind of static agrarian hierarchical society, even though it was ruled largely by a gentry rather than a traditional aristocracy. And I think that was really part of the ideological impetus for the North's crusade against the South. If you read, for example, the songs of some of the Civil War battle songs, Union battle songs. The classic one, of course, is the Battle Hymn of the Republic. But if you read the lyrics of the Battle Hymn of the Republic, they're trying to make this into some sort of righteous, almost religious crusade against these backward Southerners, these reactionary, old European model Southerners. This is not just a battle to preserve the Union. This is sort of an ideological crusade. And I think that many of the Northerners viewed it in this way. They viewed the war against the South as a continuation of the American Revolution, which had been a war against the traditional European model society. So you really had a kind of Jacobin type of way of thinking that was driving the war effort on the part of the North, aside from the economic and political issues involved, which were substantive. I think really the way of interpreting this revolution is, this Civil War, as making it that makes the most sense. It's a continuation of this historic class war between the ancient regime and classical liberalism that came out of Europe.
Yeah, I agree. And so would the Confederates. James Henley Thornwell wrote, "The parties in conflict are not merely abolitionists and slaveholders. They are atheists, socialists, communists, red Republicans, Jacobins on the one side, and friends of order and well-regulated freedom on the other. In one world, the world is the battleground, Christianity and atheism the combatants, and the progress of humanity at stake." It might sound a little hyperbolic to our ears, but it's hard to argue with the actual argument that Thornwell makes, because the defeat of the old traditional order that he identifies its assailants being Marxists, Jacobins, is largely true. There was this whole red Republican element. A lot of radicals from the 1848, 1849 revolutions in Europe came to the United States and were drafted into the Union Army. One of the points that of revisionist history where the libertarians have done quite a good job, people like DiLorenzo and Jeff Rickenbach and others, is that the Union cause for war and the justification for war. The idea was they tend to see Lincoln as kind of a centralizer. So they'll see him as analogous to someone like a Lenin or a Bismarck, as sort of a consolidating the nation state. Maybe sort of like the French Republic, how they consolidated the disparate French peoples into one homogeneous whole. And of course they are correct. The libertarian, the sort of paleo-libertarians and the neo-Confederates are correct in the fact that states' rights died in 1861, and that we ceased to be a collection of states, but one federal government. And Lincoln, DiLorenzo makes this claim, and other libertarians, is that Lincoln was wanted to preserve the economic integrity of the Union, the tariff. He was a strong protectionist. A lot of the Northerners were strongly protectionist. The Morrill tariff was one of the reasons cited by the Confederates for leaving the Union. In fact, there was a previous tariff in 1830s, Tariff of Abominations by Andrew Jackson, where South Carolina threatened to secede, and Jackson threatened to invade, and they backed down. But 30 odd years later, they said, no, we're not backing down this time, and the other states followed suit. And Lincoln, according to DiLorenzo and other libertarians, wanted to see, they were afraid that the South would become a free trade zone, and trade would then bypass New England into the South because there's less barriers to entry for European goods. And so they wanted to prevent that from happening. So they wanted to rope the South back in. In fact, this argument dovetails quite nicely with Lysander Spooner's No Treason. He argues that, no, he actually doesn't believe slavery at all was the cause for the war. He says it was a transparent fiction. He says that the northern bankers wanted to exploit and loot and conquer the South, and that if they left, they wouldn't be able to do so. And I think Spooner is probably onto something there as well. This mercantile class wanting to exploit the South economically, and so in order to do this, they start seceding. Now, initially, it's the 8 deep South states. There's 3 states on the border: Virginia, Tennessee, and Arkansas, which I don't think initially secede. And the original capital was, I think, Montgomery, Alabama, of the Confederacy. When Lincoln raised troops to invade the 8 southern states, these 3 border states of Virginia, Tennessee, and Arkansas left to join the Confederacy. And he needed a pretext to go to when he invaded, so that he could appear to be the aggrieved party. And Fort Sumter was that pretext. He seemed to be giving mixed messages at the beginning of the war. He at one point would say he's going to withdraw, then he changed his mind and sends supplies to Fort Sumter, dilly-dallying and buying time. And so the Confederates realized, well, the longer we wait, the stronger Fort Sumter is going to get. And so they attack it. And in fact, nobody actually died in the siege of Fort Sumter. It's one of the few bloodless battles of the Civil War. It was after a short siege and some shots fired at the wall. They just realized the blockade was so well at the point that it was so complete at the time that they surrendered without really any bloodshed, which was not what would be the case for the rest of the war. And so this sort of Yankee mercantilism, which sought to close up the potential free trade zone of the South in order to exploit it for its own purposes, which seems to be the argument of the libertarians and the anarchists Sanders Spooner, they've made, I think, a very compelling case over the years with the revisionist literature. What do you think of the libertarian case for this, Keith?
Well, I think on a more general level, it's important to understand the economic factors that led to the growth of the Civil War, and I mean the breakout of the Civil War. And I think that what De Lorenzo and some of these other people have done is correct in the sense that there was an effort to essentially exploit the South in a way that would have been prevented if the South had split off and formed a separate republic. You mentioned to me off the air here that the Marxists had a similar interpretation of the nature of the U.S. Civil War to the one I outlined when I was speaking previously. And I think that one thing that needs to be considered is that when the Lincoln government came to power, this was also during the time when American capitalism was really starting to take root. This was the time of industrial expansion. This was the time when the big railroad companies and all of these kinds of things were really starting to gain a lot of influence over the federal government. And it's clear that the mercantile interests in the United States had as their objective the creation of this kind of federal capitalist empire, if you will. In fact, I think that was one of the objectives initially with the writing of the U.S. Constitution. If you look at the objections that the authors of the U.S. Constitution had to the Articles of Confederation, if you look at some of the provisions of the U.S. Constitution, for example, the enumerated powers that are given to the federal government, you see one of the objectives there is to create this large free trade area in North America. One of the things they didn't like about the Articles of Confederation was that individual states could erect tariff barriers and things like that, and they could have their own bankruptcy laws and all of these kinds of things. They wanted a uniform trade system throughout the colonies, or the former colonies. And I think this kind of thinking also shaped a lot of the impetus behind the Civil War as well. By this time, you had a much better developed industrial class and merchant class, and a much more powerful one. And they really saw the whole North American continent as a place to develop this kind of huge free trade zone that would be oriented towards industrial development, a kind of state capitalism. And these were the people, the elements that backed Lincoln were also the elements that that were very much in favor of the railroad expansion and use of the federal government for these kinds of purposes. Now, clearly, the idea of the southern states, which they regarded these backward agrarian states, organized as a European model society, clearly they regarded the mere existence of this system that we in the South as an impediment to this, and as an impediment to the expansion of the industrial system. So I think that they really saw the Civil War as a convenient mode by which to not only prevent the South from seceding, but wiping out the entire social infrastructure of the South. I think what one of the primary objectives behind the Civil War was that Northern industrial and mercantile interests wanted to preserve the Union, certainly, in part because they wanted to convert the Union into this massive free trade zone, but they also wanted to eradicate the social structures in the South that they viewed as an impediment to the development of industrial capitalism. And I think a lot of the elements of Reconstruction that came after the war were meant for this purpose as well. It was meant for the purpose of turning the South into what was, by the standards of the time, a modern bourgeois republic. And when that failed, I think they retaliated simply by imposing what amounted to an economic blockade on the South. And there was a lot of trade discrimination against the South that lasted well into the 20th century. It's another story. So the economic factors can't be discounted at all. I think a lot of historians really do a disservice to the narrative when they're focusing on all the moral issues like slavery, or the political issues like the right of secession versus preserving the Union, or Lincoln's personality, or Jefferson Davis' personality. All of those are interesting, and all of that obviously fits into the wider story about what actually happened in the U.S. Civil War. But I think one thing the Marxists got right is the way that they interpreted this as a class war between the old order and between the new bourgeois order. And the Marxists and other radicals in Europe were jubilant over the U.S. Civil War. They thought the war was wonderful, the war against the South. Another thing, too, is that the Marxists were also big on the Mexican War. They actually thought the Mexican War was wonderful. And you can go back and find the writings of Engels and others where they talk about this, how it's great, that the Americans have taken over Mexico and taken it out of the hands of these backward Mexicans. Marxists in the 19th century were very pro-imperialist. They were not like the Marxists of the late 20th century during the anti-colonial period. And all of this kind of thinking, I think, formed a big part of the ideological impetus behind the Civil War. I don't think it's just a matter of the whole moral question of slavery, or even some of the economic issues that are more well known, like the tariffs and all of that. I think there's this wider set of visions about what kind of social order the different sides wanted to have.
Yes, I think for our purposes here, the next important issue to discuss is the prosecution of the war and how it evolved from a war of the typical European style, which was still kind of a gentleman's war, even if it was a bloodier version due to modern technology, to a total war. So there's really two phases here, the way the war was prosecuted by the North. And there is the between the general-in-chief of Winfield Scott to Henry W. Halleck, so it'd be Scott, McClellan, and Halleck, were the general-in-chief of the Union Army, so that would be both Eastern and Western fronts. Scott died really early on and had very little influence in the actual prosecution of the war, though he was a military fine tactician and strategist of his own on his own. But McClellan and Halleck were somewhat ineffectual, but they continued to fight the war along the traditional European lines, the lines that Scott had used in 1812 and in Mexico. Now Grant was different. Grant and his little inner cadre of people like Sheridan and Sherman and others were of a new breed of men. And part of this comes from the experience of the Seminole War, at least for Sherman it does, and the Indian fighting. And the idea is that to break an enemy, you have to raise the cost of the war to such a degree that they will beg their side to end. So you not only attack armies, you attack foodstuffs, railroads, cities, and make it difficult for the civilian population in every possible way. Of course, the premise is ludicrous. Governments that are at war are almost never overthrown by people that they rule over. I mean, there's the Russian Revolution, which is one example. But you don't if you attack the civilians directly or indirectly, you're just going to make them mad, and they're going to rally behind the government. In order to split them apart from the government, you don't want to attack them. But you have from 1861 to beginning 1864, after the defeat at Gettysburg, the Union Army is relatively ineffectually led in the West, or in the East rather. No, I do think McClellan gets a bad day's rap because he was widely respected as a trainer of men, putting men to be fit for battle, but he's often been criticized for his generalship skills in that he was overly cautious and other things. Now, here's the thing though. basically the difference is Grant didn't care about the lives of his men and was willing to sacrifice thousands of them, tens of thousands of them, as it turns out, because he knew that the North had more men than the South and could afford to lose these men. For instance, I think it was the Battle of Spotsylvania in 1864 in Virginia, where Union soldiers would tie dog tags to themselves, knowing that if they died, they'd be so mangled that no one would know who they were except by their dog tags. um, and after all, the first major defeat against Robert E. Lee was by McClellan at the Battle of Antietam, or alternatively known as Sharpsburg. And Meade later in 1863 defeats Lee at Gettysburg. And so I think part of it, he had a concern for the welfare of his men that, again, Grant, Sherman, and Sheridan did not have. They viewed war very mechanistically. Men were machines or automata for them. It was even your own soldiers were not. They weren't really treated as humans. They were just cogs in the machine that you could just throw at the enemy. Whereas in the Battle of, I think it was either Spotsylvania, I think it might have been, Robert E. Lee advanced to the front, and his men rallied around him and said, "No, go back to the rear." They were afraid that Yankee sharpshooters would kill Lee. I think it's highly unlikely that any Union soldiers would have advocated Grant to retire to the rear. They might have been happy he'd been hit by a sharpshooter. But this change of policy begins with Grant, and Lincoln picks Grant because Grant is a general that can win battles. Grant's campaigns in the West, in Tennessee, actually beginning in Kentucky, Tennessee, Mississippi, Louisiana, and in Tennessee again with Chattanooga. Well, he was very effective. Grant's policy, military strategy was get there the first with the most, and so he prioritized speed. And he had some reverses. He had a reverse at Vicksburg in the late 1862, but he later took the city. And he just used the advantages the Union had: overwhelming manpower, advanced technology more so than the South, and he used speed as a weapon. And he would very quickly just attack one Confederate army after another, and either outmaneuver them or just, if he couldn't, just grind them into the dust with superior numbers. And Lincoln saw a general who could win, and then he made him commander of the entire Union Army. And he put the practices in the East, and then in the West, his lackey Sherman would continue his campaigns. And the other thing was the blockade. Now, before he died, Winfield Scott advocated for what he called the Anaconda Plan, which was a blockade across the southern seaboard and then cutting it in half by taking the Mississippi, which is essentially what happened, and what ended up killing the South. The blockade strangled the southern economy. Initially, it was ineffective, and blockade runners could often slip by. And this is something that Niall Ferguson points out, which is very interesting and very seldom considered. The fortunes of the South, he thinks, were not doomed at Vicksburg or at Gettysburg, but when Commander Farragut took New Orleans. And the reason why he argues this is that the Confederates could get relatively profitable loans, low-interest loans from the English and the French by offering them cotton as collateral at pre-war rates, and they could then claim that cotton at any point. And as long as the blockade was weak or in its early stages, and of course the trade hub of New Orleans was open, they could get easy lines of credit. But once New Orleans was taken, the first step to closing off the Mississippi, it was much harder for the French and the British to realistically cash in on that cotton. And they then began to wonder, well, maybe this wasn't such a good investment after all. And he argues that that is where the South begins to finally lose the war, because they lose the financial easy credit that they needed. And of course, England later turned to alternative sources of cotton in Egypt and India. But back to the policy of waging the war. We saw a taste of this in Vicksburg when Grant is taking the city of Vicksburg. He shells the city, knowing full well that there were women and children in the city, and intentionally starving the city into submission. And the same tactics would be used with brutal efficiency in Atlanta. And the two I think campaigns that most highlight the savagery of this new way of war is in the Shenandoah between the Union General Sheridan and the Confederate General Jubal Early, and the South. against Sherman, and he had various opponents that were shuffled in and out to fight him. One of the worst opponents was Braxton Bragg, who at one point just marched to Nashville and totally abandoned the South, which was kind of it was very foolish. But Sherman bragged and said, "I will make Georgia howl." He tore up railroads, burned down crops, and indiscriminately shelled cities that he besieged, knowing full well that women and children were living in there starving. There are accounts of Confederate cannibalism under these extreme conditions in Vicksburg and Atlanta. And in the Shenandoah, which has been the breadbasket of the South, all of the crops were burned. Anything that wasn't nailed to the ground was taken up and moved off and sold or confiscated by the Union Army. And the level of devastation in the South is really in the 19th century. There's really not many examples you can point to. Maybe Spain under the Napoleonic Wars, maybe in the 20th century you might look at post World War II Europe. But this level of devastation, we have to imagine all the animals are taken away, the farming implements are taken away, the houses are burned to the ground, the crops are burned to the ground. These people are really left destitute. And it's on the eve of winter that this actually happens, because I think the war ends in, was it the fall of 1865? And so it's on the eve of winter that they're left with literally nothing. And this level of hardship, I think the only population in North America that could relate to that would be the indigenous Native American population and the hardships that they underwent under the western expansion of the Yankees. And this is another thing that is often overlooked by the left-wing critics of American foreign policy. They'll often be pro-Lincoln and pro-Civil War because it ended slavery. They're all, they're going to cross their progressive T's and dot their progressive I's. But every single tactic that was used against the Plains Indians, the Sioux, the Arapaho, the Comanche, the Apache, the Nez Perce tribe, were all first implemented. Right? Can you hear me, Keith? Hello?
I'm here, yes.
Did my mic die? I think my headset died.
Yeah, I think your voice dropped out for a couple of minutes there.
Okay, where did I cut off? I think my headset died on me for a moment for some reason.
You were talking about the how the damage that was inflicted on the American Indian nations was the prototype for what happened to the South in the Civil War.
Yeah, okay. So I think I covered what I wanted to. Kind of weird. My headset just died for some reason. So yeah, what would do you have any comments about that?
Yeah, well, I think you've raised a really good point in the sense that the hard left is very critical of American imperialism, and I think rightfully so. But it's always interesting how the war against the South was essentially a war of extermination against the South. is often left from that. For example, if you read the works of some of the leading left-wing critics of American foreign policy, like Howard Zinn, the late Howard Zinn, they'll go into all kinds of detail about the atrocities committed against the Native Americans, against the people in the Caribbean or Latin America or in the Philippines or in Asia or wherever. But what was actually done in the South was the prototype in many ways for all of that. In fact, it's ironic because the same, we had the ethnic cleansing of the 5 indigenous nations in the American South during the pre-Civil War period, during the time of Andrew Jackson and the Indian Exclusion Act, and we talked about that on the previous podcast. Ironically, many of those same indigenous nations that were subject to this ethnic cleansing 20 years, 30 years earlier, actually formed an alliance with the Confederacy. A lot of people do not realize that there were 5 American Indian nations that formed an alliance with the Confederacy against the Union. Now, there were also Native Americans on the Union side as well. The Native Americans were a very diverse group, many different ethnic groups. But the way in which the South was dealt with, in terms of the things you were saying, in terms of deliberate imposition of blockades on civilians for the purpose of starving out civilians, the scorched earth policy, burning Atlanta and things like that, all of that had been previously done to the Native American people before it was done to the South. And then after the war was over, the next place the Union Army went was further west, where they started using the same tactics again against some of the other American Indian nations that were further westward. So the war against the South was a big part of the American imperial expansion that happened during the 19th century. We hear about the massacres and ethnic cleansing that were carried out about the native people. We hear about the Mexican War, we hear about the Philippine War, but the war against the South was not only the same as these other wars, it was even bigger. I mean, in many ways, in terms of the number of casualties in a relatively short period of time.
Yes, yeah, exactly. It really was just this kind of level of Jacobin bloodshed really wasn't seen since the Napoleonic Wars, frankly. It really is almost a Napoleonic quality to it. This sort of brutal cruelty. The French, when they invaded Spain, pursued a very similar policy of repression, starvation, attacking civilian population centers, and things like that. And again, this was, again, a very strong break from traditional intra-European conflict. That there's been this correlation between the rise of democratic representative governments and total war. And if you look at charts of European warfare beginning in the Middle Ages, going up to World War II, the amount of civilian casualties as it relates to military casualties is an interesting mapping that you see. From the Middle Ages up until maybe the 30 Years' War, civilian casualties are growing as a percentage of total casualties in a war, culminating in the bloody 30 Years' War with about, I think, 10 million Germans alone are killed, civilians. But the next thing is, after that, Europe realizes, okay, this is a mess. So we got to stop doing this. And then from the 30 Years' War up until Napoleon, civilian representation and casualties go down. I think to the point where it's like 10% of any war casualties are civilian, which is at the lowest it's ever been. And then with Napoleon, it begins to tick back up again. Now it's kind of a brief tick, and then the post-Napoleonic wars are much more old school. But the Civil War, the Napoleonic Wars, and then finally World War I, it just goes crazy. Until now, it's now 90% are civilian casualties and 10% are military combatants, like in Iraq or Afghanistan, or even like Vietnam and World War II. And so this change can really be seen very well in the American Civil War. Sheridan famously said, when he was the observer to the German Franco-Prussian War, and he said to the Prussian officers, "You are far too gentle with the French. You should leave them with nothing but their eyes to weep over the battle, over what they've lost." And yet, he's saying when these Prussians apply these very self-same tactics in World War I, they were encouraged to by Sheridan. Now they're the worst villains ever. They're the Hun. But the fact is, they were acting out of the influence that we had given them from the Civil War and the Franco-Prussian War. So really, we almost kind of created that response from the Prussians.
Yeah, I think that's correct. I think it was really the United States in the Civil War that created the model for modern warfare. I mean, that was the first of the modern total wars, and that model expanded, during the 20th century with the world wars. I think that part of the destructiveness of modern war can be attributed to technological advancements and better weaponry, and as well as larger populations and things like that as well. But it is true that what you see is the growth of these mass societies. You see one of the products of democratic republics and of modern capitalism has been the growth of mass societies, where you no longer have a distinction being made between the military sector and the society as a whole. One thing about the French Revolution is that one thing that came out of that were these national conscript armies. Prior to that, the military tended to be more along the line of professional military, or often mercenaries and things like that. Whereas one of the things that the French Revolution achieved was this idea of a national mass army of conscripts, and that was the model on which the American Civil War was fought. And in fact, they even had massive anti-draft riots in New York during the Civil War period. And then that became the basis for the wars of the 20th century, where you had massive national armies of conscripts, where whole societies were at war with each other. And it was really during the time of the American Civil War that you see this this fundamental changeover in the nature of war starting to take place, where it becomes a war between societies rather than a war simply between armies.
Yeah, yeah. I think we're about out of time. Is there anything you want to add before we wrap this up?
Only that it's interesting, once again, like I said earlier, that how the left never considers the role of the U.S. Civil War in the expansion of American imperialism and in the creation of modern war. It's like every victim of American imperialism gets their place in the record books and the history books that are generated by the left, except the American South. They leave that out. It's really interesting to see how that works. That's like the one exception. Well, this was the one time it was okay, but they actually do that with World War II to some degree. They'll talk
It's
about
because they're white.
Yeah. It has to do with the fact that the South is perceived by the left to have been this backward European model society, and of course they had slavery and racism and all that. So that's why the left tends to view that war as an acceptable war. For the same reason they view World War II as an acceptable war for the most part, whereas the Cold War was awful, and the Vietnam and Korea and all that were awful, and even some leftists will say World War I was a bad idea, but no, World War II, that was the good one, because of who the enemy was. It is interesting, though, how this narrative has been created, where you have all this conventional narrative that has the good wars versus the bad wars. The good wars were the American Revolution, the Civil War, World War II, and so forth. The bad wars were the ones, essentially where the bad wars were the ones where that were perceived as wars against the left. Vietnam or Korea or any of that.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's important to maybe highlight before we end this what the United States was like in 1865. For the first time in 1865, the United States is a fairly centralized political unit. The sort of more federative system of states' rights was thoroughly destroyed. The Union Army was numbered in the millions, highly trained, well-trained professional soldiers. Probably in 1865, the best soldiers in the world, with the possible exception of the Prussians, due to their just rigorous combat experience. In fact, they were so powerful that they threatened to invade Mexico to drive the French out. So Napoleon III just left. And this leaves America poised to expand across the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. It has no domestic enemies at home. The South has been crushed. They'll proceed to crush the indigenous populations over the next 20, 30 years. And they then begin to have a period of massive economic development, industrial development, where they grow and become the world's largest economy. And so by the time we get to World War I, this sleeping giant is a united, centralized economic juggernaut that is just waiting to get onto the world stage. And I think that that's all a legacy of the Civil War. So this is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.